we were talking about Shakespeare's children. His first, Susanna, was born 6 months after his marriage to Anne Hathaway. Later, he had twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet and Judith, which is interesting because, of course, he writes about Hamlet, which is very similar to the name of his son. Hamnet actually died when he was 11 years old. Susanna is buried in the same location, not in the same grave, but in the same location as William Shakespeare. And actually, he stayed close to his eldest daughter, Susanna, for her whole life. Okay, that gives us a little bit of detail about his younger years. It's about all we've got. Okay, then he moved to London. We know that the twins, let's do this, baptized, let's put this on here too, baptized in 1585. So that's when the twins were born. But as early as 1592, we know that Shakespeare had moved to London. Now, we don't have any evidence that he took Anne or the children with him to London. So Hamnet would have still been alive because he didn't die until he was 11. They were baptized in 1585, so this is 7 years later. We have no evidence that he took his family to London with him. It's believed that he left Anne back in Stratford-upon-Avon with the children, and he moved himself to London to write more plays and to perform them. Okay. The intervening years are considered the lost years of William Shakespeare because we just don't have any information about them. There's no body of work that can refer to the time during these gaps and tell us what he was doing during that time. All right, we do know that while he was in London, he became a founding member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men. The Lord Chamberlain's Men, which was an acting troupe. Later, they changed the name of this troupe to the King's Men. Oh, excuse me, the King's Men. This is important to know. It's important to know that the acting troupe that he employed and that he wrote for was called the King's Men. They were under the patronage. What does that mean? What does patronage mean? Specifically, the person who sponsored them, who paid for them, because they didn't have any income. So it was the king, King James the First. King James the First was their patron. So in other words, the king was the one who paid them to write the plays and perform them. And now they did obviously charge for people to come and attend their plays, but they didn't make anywhere near enough money from that. By the time they split it up amongst all the actors, there wasn't enough money for them to live on. So it was only through patronage of wealthy people that they were able to continue to act to keep the Globe Theatre afloat. And so in this case, it was King James I who was their patron. Okay. During this time, Shakespeare wrote some of his most important tragedies, such as King Lear, most famous. Tragedies were written during this time. For example, King Lear, Macbeth, as well as some of his romances. The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. Okay. All right. In 1597, Shakespeare purchased a property in Stratford-upon-Avon that he named New Place. He bought a home. And this is his residence that I told you about, we know very little about, except that during excavations, they've discovered, I don't know how they've discovered this, but they've made discoveries that has led them to believe that Shakespeare did not live here full time, that he actually divided his time between Stratford-upon-Avon and London, which was a 2 or 3 day commute to London from Stratford-upon-Avon back during those days. So he'd live at Stratford-upon-Avon, probably writing a play. Then he'd leave and he'd go to London. They'd practice and perform. Then he'd come back. So he was splitting his time up between New Place, his residence in Stratford-upon-Avon, and London. Okay. They think now, it's come to the attention of scholars, that towards his later years as he aged, they think he spent more and more time in New Place in Stratford-upon-Avon. Probably, 100 years ago, they thought that he lived exclusively in London, but now they're seeing more and more evidence that he actually, as he aged, spent more time in New Place. Shakespeare died in Stratford-upon-Avon on April 23rd, which I think I put on the last slide. April 23rd, which he was born on April 23rd, 1616. Oh. He was 52 years old. He is buried in the sanctuary of the parish church in Holy Trinity. When we say the sanctuary, it really is the sanctuary. If you've ever been to old cathedrals, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Europe, but in the churches, they actually would bury people, but you had to pay a fair amount of money to be able to be buried within the church. And it was expensive, and the closer you were to the altar, the more expensive it was. Shakespeare was determined that he wanted to be buried there, and there was an issue with his daughter Susanna over who had to pay. I think Susanna's husband ended up paying dearly for Shakespeare to be able to be buried in the parish church very near the altar. All right, a couple of things I want to tell you about Shakespeare's death. One is, hopefully everybody's written this down because I'm going to, well, I don't know if I'll write this down or just read it to you. But I want to tell you a couple of interesting facts about Shakespeare. One of the interesting facts that I want to tell you is it was very common during Shakespeare's time for people's remains to be dug up. I don't know why. I don't know if it was grave robbers or if it was a result of wanting to move people or if it was an issue that, somebody come along who was willing to pay the church more money. So they would actually dig somebody's body up and move them someplace else and put the person who was willing to pay more money. But it was very common for people's remains to be moved. So Shakespeare had an epitaph that was actually put on his grave. I got to see it. I took pictures of it when we went to his grave in the church, in the parish church. And what it said was, it was hard to read because it was written in Middle English. So U's were V's, but what this epitaph said, and it was engraved on this huge stone that was laid on top of his tomb, it said, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones and cursed be he that moves my bones. So he actually brought down a curse on anyone who would move his remains. So what he's saying is, good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear, don't do it, to dig the dust enclosed here. Don't dig around in the dust of my grave. Forbear from doing that. Keep from doing it. Blessed be the man that spares these stones. Blessed is the man, he's calling down a blessing on the people that don't touch his burial stones. And cursed be he that moves my bones. So it was kind of shocking that that's what he wanted put on his gravestone. He didn't want William Shakespeare, famous poet to the Queen, or famous playwright, founder of the Globe Theater. He didn't want any of that stuff. He wanted a curse and a blessing put on his tombstone, and that's what he did. All right. Couple other little interesting stories that you probably won't hear anyplace else, but from me, when we were in England and we went to Stratford-upon-Avon, we did one of these bus tours, you know, with open air buses, and our driver told us a lot of stories about things that had happened in Stratford-upon-Avon. Stories that Shakespeare would have known about because they happened during his lifetime. For example, there was a story about a woman who died and was buried in the family tomb. And so it was like it was a sepulcher. It was how do I describe this? It was they had a family tomb. So it was a huge building. And then within that tomb, there were different graves. Anyway, this woman was buried, and about 6 months later, a family, or maybe it was longer than 6 months, but it was within a fairly reasonable amount of time, another family died, and they went back in and, you know, took off the main stone to bury this other person, and discovered that the woman had been buried alive. She must have been in a coma, but she woke, came out of her coma, and had been buried alive. The way they know this is that she scratched, literally pulled her fingernails out, scratching on the stone that held her under the ground to try and get out. And eventually she died of starvation in her tomb. So that was something that happened in Stratford-upon-Avon when they, you know, unearthed the tomb to put another family member in there, discovered that she had been buried alive. And apparently that wasn't that uncommon. There were actually wealthy people that were so afraid of that they had contracts. They paid people in advance to go and dig them back up and make sure periodically that they really were dead so that they wouldn't be buried alive. I read a story once about a man who actually put a bell in his grave with a line that went up so that he could pull on that line and ring that bell, and it would ring a bell up above to let people know he was still alive because he was so afraid of being buried alive. Anyway, it's believed by locals that that particular event, which happened while Shakespeare was alive, while he was living in Stratford-upon-Avon as a young man before he married Anne Hathaway and then moved away to London, it's believed that that's where he got the idea in Romeo and Juliet for them to go into the tomb. In Romeo and Juliet, you probably recall that there's a potion involved, and one of them thinks the other one is dead, so they kill themselves, and then the first one is just taking a potion to sleep, and then they wake up and Juliet is dead. Anyway, so they believe that that theme of being in a tomb and appearing dead but not really being dead was the result of something that actually occurred in Stratford-upon-Avon. There were lots and lots of stories of that kind that we heard while we were in Stratford-upon-Avon. So a lot of twists and turns in Shakespeare's plays were things that had been based on real life events. It's just interesting, in my opinion, to know that. I'd never heard that until we actually moved there, visited there. All right. Well, that concludes our lecture on William Shakespeare. Just so you are aware, the next period we're going to be going into is the Jacobean period. In the Jacobean period, we're going to continue to learn a little bit more about Shakespeare, but we're also going to look at some other authors. One thing that I forgot to tell you was that Christopher Marlowe was Shakespeare's biggest rival. They knew each other, they knew each other's works, and Shakespeare felt like Christopher Marlowe was the person that he had to be better than. And of course, Chris Marlowe died at the age of 29, and from then, Shakespeare was able to take that position as the most important dramatist of England and England's poet, official poet, national poet. Okay, so that's all we're going to say now about Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare and the Elizabethan period. That concludes our lectures on this time frame. The next time you'll be watching lectures, we'll be moving into the Jacobean period. And again, I'm hoping that you really enjoyed The Taming of the Shrew. All right, class, see you later.